The ranch had always existed in a quiet rhythm, one shaped by sunrise, dust, and long-established boundaries that didn't need signs or fences to feel real. The land stretched wide and patient, passed down with paperwork thick enough to tell its own story. Deeds, easements, agricultural exemptions, federal conservation agreements, documents that mattered only when someone decided they didn't. For years, no one questioned the gate at the eastern access road. It had been there longer than the neighborhood itself, longer than the HOA signs, longer than the manicured lawns that now pressed up against the edge of working land. That changed the moment the subdivision expanded. At first, the homeowners treated the ranch like scenery, something rustic to look at from behind vinyl fencing. But scenery has a way of becoming inconvenient when it blocks shortcuts. Residents began cutting across the access road, ignoring posted agricultural notices and locked schedules. Trucks hauling feed were forced to stop, equipment was delayed, gates were left open, livestock wandered. Each small disruption stacked quietly, unnoticed by those causing it, but deeply felt by the person responsible for everything on that land. The solution had been simple and legal: reinforce the ranch gate. The gate wasn't decorative, it was heavy steel, mounted on reinforced posts with reflective agricultural signage clearly marking it as private access. It complied with county requirements and federal land use regulations tied to the ranch's conservation funding. It was installed with permits, inspections, and approvals that had been filed months in advance. Nothing about it was rushed or secretive. Notices had even been sent to the HOA board, explaining that the access road was not and had never been a public neighborhood thoroughfare. The HOA ignored them. Within days, complaints started flowing, not to the ranch owner, but to the HOA president, a woman who had recently taken control of the board loudly and confidently, positioning herself as the defender of community rights. To her, the ranch wasn't land with a history, it was an obstacle, and obstacles, in her worldview, existed to be removed. She drove down to the gate herself. Her SUV pulled up squarely in front of it, blocking access completely. Not parked nearby, not pulled off to the side, placed directly across the gate, as if to physically challenge it. Photos were taken, calls were made. She declared the gate illegal, the road public, and the ranch owner non-compliant with HOA community standards, standards that had no jurisdiction beyond the subdivision. Then she called the cops. When law enforcement arrived, the scene looked simple on the surface: a locked gate, a blocked road, an angry HOA president insisting the ranch owner was obstructing community access. But ranch land doesn't operate on surface impressions, it operates on records. The responding officers asked questions. They looked at the signage, they requested documentation. The HOA president spoke loudly and confidently, asserting authority she believed she had. She referenced bylaws, neighborhood maps, and verbal assurances from developers who no longer worked there. She demanded immediate removal of the gate and threatened fines, lawsuits, and daily citations. The ranch owner said very little. Instead, documentation was provided. County plats showing the access road terminating at the ranch boundary, easement records proving HOA residents had no legal right of passage, agricultural permits tied to livestock movement schedules, federal conservation agreements that required controlled access to prevent land degradation. Each document layered calmly onto the situation, shifting it from a neighborhood complaint into a jurisdictional problem the HOA hadn't anticipated. The officers reviewed everything carefully. They informed the HOA president that the gate was legal, that the road was private, that blocking it with a vehicle constituted obstruction, and that calling law enforcement under false pretenses could result in consequences if repeated. The SUV was moved. But the damage was already done, not to the ranch, but to the HOA's sense of control.
The incident spread quickly through neighborhood forums and social media groups, framed not as an act of legal correction, but as an act of defiance by a ranch owner who thought he was above the community. The HOA president leaned into that narrative. She issued violation notices. She proposed emergency HOA meetings. She began drafting letters accusing the ranch of reducing property values and endangering residents. What she didn't do was research who actually oversaw the land beyond her subdivision. The ranch wasn't just privately owned, it was federally registered under multiple rural development and conservation programs that funneled funding into infrastructure, water management, and land preservation, funding that also indirectly supported the surrounding community. Roads, drainage systems, and environmental credits tied the ranch and the subdivision together in ways the HOA board had never bothered to understand. The HOA president escalated anyway. She contacted county offices demanding enforcement. She filed complaints alleging environmental violations. She claimed the gate restricted emergency access despite alternative routes clearly marked and approved. Each complaint triggered reviews, and each review traced back to the same conclusion. The ranch was compliant, documented, and protected. Still, the HOA pushed harder. They sent a cease and desist letter drafted by an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes, but not agricultural law. The letter threatened legal action unless the gate was removed within 30 days. It accused the ranch owner of violating community harmony and interfering with residents' rights. The letter arrived with a sense of finality the HOA believed was justified. But to the ranch owner, it was something entirely else. It was confirmation that the HOA had no idea who they were dealing with, because the ranch owner didn't just participate in federal programs, they administered them locally. Oversight committees, grant compliance reviews, advisory roles that ensured funding went where it's supposed to and stopped when regulations were violated. The same regulations the HOA was now threatening to ignore by attempting to force illegal access through protected land. The gate had started as a practical necessity. Now it was a line in the sand. As the HOA prepared to take back what they believed was a community road, the ranch owner began preparing something far more impactful, not retaliation, but accountability. Paperwork was gathered, timelines were assembled, communications were archived. Every call, every complaint, every violation notice was logged carefully. Because when federal funding is involved, intent matters, and the HOA had just demonstrated theirs.
The HOA believed escalation meant volume. More emails, more complaints, more urgency stamped across every message sent to county offices and local agencies. Emergency board meetings were scheduled with little notice, framed as crises that demanded immediate action. Residents were told their safety was at risk, that property values were being threatened, that the ranch owner was acting recklessly, selfishly, and illegally. None of it was supported by fact, but repetition gave the illusion of truth. Behind the scenes, something very different was happening. The ranch owner wasn't reacting emotionally or publicly. There were no social media posts, no confrontational visits to HOA meetings, no counter threats. Instead, there was quiet preparation. Every HOA communication was cataloged. Every false claim was cross-referenced against actual statutes. County records were pulled. Federal compliance documents were reviewed line by line, not for defense, but for exposure. Because when an HOA overreaches into regulated land, the issue stops being personal and becomes procedural. The first red flag appeared in the HOA's emergency resolution. In their rush to assert authority, the board had formally voted to reclaim and reopen the access road. That vote was recorded in meeting minutes and distributed to residents. It included language authorizing contractors to remove unauthorized obstructions if the ranch owner failed to comply voluntarily. That language mattered. It demonstrated intent to interfere with federally regulated land access.
It wasn't speculation, it wasn't hearsay, it was documented policy. The ranch owner forwarded those minutes to a regional oversight office tied to rural infrastructure grants, not as a complaint, but as a request for clarification. The question was simple. Did an HOA have the authority to interfere with controlled access land tied to federal funding programs? The response wasn't immediate, but it was inevitable. While the gears turned at the federal level, the HOA pressed forward locally. A contractor was contacted, estimates were requested, photos of the gate were circulated with annotations calling it non-compliant and hazardous. The HOA president framed the situation as a standoff, painting herself as the lone figure brave enough to stand up to a powerful landowner. What she didn't understand was that power doesn't always announce itself. County officials began receiving calls, not from the HOA, but from federal compliance officers requesting documentation. They wanted to see permits, easements, and enforcement actions related to the ranch access road. They wanted to know why a private HOA was attempting to assert jurisdiction beyond its boundary. They wanted timelines. Those calls made county administrators nervous. The county had approved the ranch permits years ago. They had signed off on conservation agreements. They had acknowledged the access road as private agricultural infrastructure. Any suggestion that they had failed to protect federally regulated land could result in audits, clawbacks, or worse. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't the loudest voice in the room anymore. The ranch owner was contacted by a county liaison, not with demands, but with concern. Questions were asked carefully. The tone was cooperative. The message was clear without being stated outright. Whatever the HOA was doing, it needed to stop before it triggered consequences no one wanted. Meanwhile, the HOA president interpreted the silence from the ranch as weakness. She sent another letter. This one accused the ranch owner of weaponizing bureaucracy and stonewalling community rights. She copied more people. She widened the audience. She believed pressure would force compliance. Instead, it created a larger record. Each email expanded the paper trail. Each accusation, unsupported by evidence, became another data point. The ranch owner didn't respond publicly. Responses were routed through proper channels, phrased neutrally, and archived. Then the first formal notice arrived. It wasn't addressed to the HOA personally. It was addressed to the HOA as an entity. A federal inquiry letter requesting information regarding attempted interference with land under active conservation and infrastructure funding agreements. It cited statutes. It requested meeting minutes, correspondence, and contractor communications related to the access road. The HOA board was blindsided. Emergency meetings were called again, but the tone had shifted. Confidence was replaced with confusion. Board members who had trusted the president's assurances began asking questions. Legal counsel was consulted, and for the first time, the attorney asked whether the HOA had verified jurisdiction before taking action. They hadn't. The attorney requested time to review the situation, which was code for backtracking as carefully as possible. But the damage was already done. Federal inquiries don't disappear because someone changes their mind. They exist to determine whether funding conditions have been violated. And the HOA was connected to that funding, whether they liked it or not. The subdivision benefited from infrastructure grants tied to the ranch's land management program. Drainage improvements, erosion control, shared road maintenance credits, all flowed through the same regulatory ecosystem. If the HOA was found to be interfering with compliance, those benefits could be suspended. The ranch owner understood this fully. That understanding wasn't leverage used for threats. It was leverage built into the system. The ranch owner didn't have to demand anything. All they had to do was answer questions honestly when asked. And questions were coming faster now. Residents began noticing changes. County inspectors appeared, not at the ranch, but in the subdivision. Measurements were taken, notes were made. HOA landscaping choices were reviewed for environmental compliance. Stormwater runoff patterns were examined more closely than ever before. The HOA president assured everyone it was routine, but board members knew better. They started distancing themselves. Emails became cautious. Proposals were delayed. The estimate for gate removal was quietly shelved. No one wanted to authorize anything that could make the situation worse. The president, however, refused to retreat. She framed the federal inquiry as intimidation. She claimed the ranch owner was pulling strings. She urged the board to stand firm, arguing that backing down would set a dangerous precedent. Her language grew more aggressive, less measured, and increasingly personal. That shift would prove costly, because intent matters and tone reveals it. The ranch owner forwarded the latest communications as part of an ongoing compliance review. No commentary was added, no accusations were made. The documents spoke for themselves. By the end of the month, the HOA was no longer dealing with a gate dispute. It was dealing with oversight. And oversight doesn't negotiate with emotion. As the HOA struggled to maintain unity, the ranch owner prepared for the next phase, not escalation, but resolution, one that would make it impossible for the HOA to ever confuse imagined authority with real power. The gate still stood, unmoved and lawful, but the ground beneath the HOA was starting to shift.
By the time the HOA realized the situation had moved beyond their control, the narrative they had relied on no longer mattered. The story of a stubborn ranch owner blocking a community road had collapsed under the weight of documentation, statutes, and scrutiny. What replaced it was far less comfortable, an investigation with timelines, accountability, and real stakes. The Federal Review didn't announce itself loudly. There were no dramatic letters threatening immediate punishment. Instead, there was a steady, methodical request for information that expanded week by week. Each request exposed another assumption the HOA had made without verifying, another decision taken without authority. The HOA board received a formal compliance questionnaire. It asked about jurisdiction, about training, about how the board verified land ownership before attempting enforcement actions. It requested copies of all communications related to the gate, including internal messages between board members. It asked whether any contractors had been instructed to interfere with controlled access land. It asked whether residents had been encouraged to use routes that were not legally public. Answering those questions required honesty, and honesty was dangerous. The board met in closed session, not to plan strategy, but to manage fear. Members who had supported the president's aggressive stance now worried about personal liability. HOA board protections only go so far, and they do not extend to willful interference with federally regulated programs. The word willful appeared multiple times in the questionnaire, each instance underlined by the implication that ignorance was no longer a defense. The president insisted they push back. She argued that cooperation would be interpreted as admission. She suggested limiting responses, delaying submissions, and challenging the authority of the inquiry itself. But the attorney, now far less confident than before, advised caution. Federal reviews don't respond well to obstruction. Silence can be interpreted as non-compliance. Reluctantly, the board began compiling documents. As they did, uncomfortable truths surfaced. Emails in which the president had dismissed boundary records as technicalities. Messages encouraging residents to ignore the gate and use it until they can't. Notes referencing the ranch owner as overconfident and bluffing. Each one added context, painting a picture not of misunderstanding, but of disregard. The ranch owner, meanwhile, was being asked entirely different questions. The tone of those conversations was professional, even respectful. Officials wanted clarification, not confrontation. They asked about the purpose of the gate, about livestock movement, about compliance protocols. They asked whether the ranch owner had experienced interference and how it had been handled.
Every answer was supported by records. There were no embellishments, no emotional language, just dates, permits, and established procedures. The contrast between the two sides became impossible to ignore. Then came the site visit. Federal and county representatives arrived together not just at the ranch, but at the subdivision. They walked the access road, they examined the gate, they observed alternative emergency routes clearly marked and unobstructed. They noted signage the HOA claimed didn't exist. They reviewed maps showing the subdivision boundaries stopping short of the ranch land. Residents watched from behind windows and fences, whispering. This wasn't routine. Everyone could feel it. The HOA president attempted to insert herself into the process, offering explanations and interpretations that hadn't been requested. She spoke over officials. She challenged conclusions in real time. Each interruption was noted politely and ignored procedurally. Oversight doesn't argue, it records. After the visit, the HOA received a preliminary findings notice. It didn't include penalties yet, it included determinations. The gate was lawful, the access road was private, the HOA had exceeded its authority. Attempts to remove or block the gate would constitute interference with federally regulated land use. Any further action would escalate the matter significantly. For most boards, that would have been the end. For this president, it was a challenge. She sent out a community-wide message framing the findings as temporary and under appeal. She accused the ranch owner of manipulating the system. She urged residents to show solidarity and continued demanding access. She claimed the HOA was being bullied by outside forces. That message was forwarded directly to compliance officers by multiple recipients, because now residents were paying attention. Some had begun asking their own questions. Why was the HOA risking funding tied to drainage improvements? Why were inspectors suddenly scrutinizing neighborhood runoff? Why was the board spending legal fees on a fight that seemed unwinnable? Dissent grew quietly at first, then openly. Board members started resigning. One cited personal reasons, another moved out of state, a third simply stopped attending meetings. Each departure weakened the president's control and increased scrutiny on her decisions. The ranch owner remained silent publicly. That silence was no longer interpreted as weakness, it was recognized as confidence. Then came the letter that changed everything. The Federal Oversight Office issued a notice of conditional funding suspension, not a full cutoff, but a warning. Certain grants tied to shared infrastructure would be paused pending resolution of the HOA's compliance issues. The notice outlined steps required to restore good standing, including formal acknowledgement of jurisdictional limits and documented corrective action. The HOA president read the letter and focused on one phrase: corrective action. To her, that meant negotiation. She requested a meeting with the ranch owner. It was the first time she had done so without law enforcement, attorneys, or public posturing. The request was formal, restrained, and noticeably less confident than her previous communications. The ranch owner agreed, not out of obligation, but because timing mattered. The meeting wouldn't be about compromise, it would be about clarity. Because the next chapter of this story wouldn't be written in emails or inspections. It would be written in decisions, ones that would determine whether the HOA survived this intact or became a case study in how quickly imagined authority collapses under real oversight.
The meeting took place in a neutral setting, chosen deliberately to remove the illusion of control the HOA president had relied on for months. There was no long conference table stamped with community logos, no audience of supportive residents, no chance to dominate the room through familiarity. Just a small, professional space with records laid out neatly and expectations clearly defined. The HOA president arrived with a folder thicker than confidence, but thinner than preparation.
The ranch owner arrived with documentation already submitted, already reviewed, and already understood by the agencies now watching closely. This meeting wasn't a negotiation in the traditional sense. It was an opportunity for the HOA to stop making things worse. The president began with reframing. She positioned the conflict as a misunderstanding fueled by poor communication. She referenced resident frustrations, safety concerns, and perceived inequities. She spoke at length about community cohesion, about how emotions had run high, about how no one intended to interfere with federal programs. But intent had already been evaluated. What mattered now was behavior. The ranch owner didn't counter emotionally. Instead, the discussion was redirected to specifics. Meeting minutes authorizing contractor interference, emails encouraging residents to ignore the gate, public statements dismissing legal boundaries. Each item was addressed calmly, one by one, with the same measured tone used in compliance reviews. There was no accusation in the delivery. There didn't need to be. The president attempted to pivot toward compromise, suggesting shared access schedules or temporary openings. That suggestion was declined, not out of stubbornness, but because it wasn't legally available. Federal conservation agreements didn't allow discretionary access based on HOA preference. Compliance wasn't flexible, it was binary. That was the moment the president finally understood. This wasn't a power struggle between two stubborn parties. It was a structural mismatch. She had been operating inside a system where authority was performative, where confidence often substituted for legitimacy. The ranch owner operated inside a system where authority was documented, reviewed, and enforced quietly, but absolutely. The meeting ended without drama. There were no raised voices, no ultimatums, just a clear outline of what corrective action would look like if the HOA wanted funding restored and scrutiny reduced. Formal acknowledgement of boundaries, written retraction of enforcement claims, a cease of all interference attempts, mandatory board training on jurisdictional limits, and accountability. The president was informed, indirectly but unmistakably, that continued misrepresentation could shift the inquiry from institutional to personal. Board immunity does not protect individuals who knowingly mislead regulators. That message lingered. Within days, the HOA board convened again, this time without grandstanding. The atmosphere had changed completely. Members spoke carefully. Motions were phrased conservatively. The gate was no longer described as a problem, but as a resolved issue with lingering consequences. A motion was introduced to formally acknowledge the ranch access road as private. It passed. Another motion followed, authorizing communication to residents, clarifying that the gate was lawful and not subject to HOA enforcement. It passed as well, though not unanimously. The president abstained, citing concerns about wording. That abstention didn't go unnoticed. Residents began seeing transparency for the first time. The carefully curated narrative of HOA overreach cracked, revealing the cost of ego-driven governance. Questions flooded inboxes. Why had the board ignored legal advice earlier? Why had the president dismissed documentation? Why was funding now at risk? The president issued a statement taking partial responsibility while deflecting blame toward external complexities. It satisfied no one. Meanwhile, corrective action reports were submitted to federal oversight. They included acknowledgments, policy updates, and proof that interference had ceased. Inspectors reviewed the submissions carefully, comparing them against previous communications. Progress was noted, but resolution wasn't immediate. Trust, once shaken, takes time to rebuild. The ranch owner returned to routine. Livestock moved on schedule, equipment traveled through the gate uninterrupted. The land resumed its quiet rhythm. From the outside, it appeared nothing had changed, but within the HOA, everything had. The board was fractured. Some members wanted to move on quietly. Others believed the president's leadership had endangered the community. Informal discussions about removal began circulating. No one wanted to be associated with further fallout. The president, sensing the shift, attempted to regain control through procedure. She scheduled another meeting, tightened agendas, limited public comment. But authority built on confidence alone evaporates once legitimacy is questioned. Then came the final complication. A whistleblower complaint was filed, not by the ranch owner, but by a former board member who had resigned earlier. The complaint alleged deliberate misrepresentation to regulators and suppression of dissent within the board. It included screenshots, timelines, and corroborating documents. Federal oversight acknowledged receipt. The scope of review expanded. What had begun as a gate dispute was now an examination of governance. The ranch owner was informed as a courtesy, not a warning. The process would continue with or without further involvement. The ranch had done everything required. The HOA, however, was standing on a narrowing ledge.
By the time the final notices arrived, the HOA president already knew the outcome. The tension in the neighborhood had shifted from confrontation to anticipation. Residents weren't asking who was right anymore. They were asking how bad it was going to be. The expanded review concluded quietly, as these things always do. There was no dramatic press release, no public spectacle, just certified letters, formal findings, and consequences laid out in precise, unemotional language. The HOA was found non-compliant, not because of a single mistake, but because of a pattern, a documented trail of overreach, misrepresentation, and refusal to acknowledge jurisdictional limits even after being corrected. The findings cited the emergency resolution, the contractor discussions, the public messaging, and the president's continued defiance after preliminary determinations were issued. Corrective action had been attempted, but it had come too late. Federal funding tied to shared infrastructure was formally suspended, not permanently, but indefinitely, pending a complete governance reset and third-party oversight. Drainage upgrades were paused, environmental credits were frozen, county cooperation was reduced to bare minimum statutory requirements. The financial impact was immediate. Special assessments were discussed, HOA dues increased, planned projects were canceled. Residents who had once cheered the president's tough stance now demanded explanations. Anger replaced pride, and accountability finally found its target. The president was removed. The vote wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. A special meeting, properly noticed, with legal counsel present. The motion cited loss of confidence, exposure to liability, and failure to act in the association's best interest. When the vote passed, there was no applause, just relief. She left quietly, her authority dissolved not by opposition, but by process. A new interim board was installed, tasked with repairing relationships and restoring compliance. Their first act was to issue a formal apology, not to the ranch owner personally, but to regulators and residents for mismanagement and overreach. The tone was markedly different from anything that had come before. The ranch owner acknowledged receipt. Nothing more was required. Over the following months, changes became visible. Board training was completed. Policies were rewritten. Jurisdictional maps were added to every orientation packet. Legal counsel specializing in land use law replaced the previous generalist. Slowly, methodically, trust was rebuilt. Funding was eventually restored in stages, not as a reward, but as a recognition that the HOA had learned the lesson oversight was designed to teach. Authority is not self-declared. It is granted, limited, and revocable. The gate remained, not as a symbol of defiance, but as what it had always been, a lawful, necessary part of working land. Residents stopped talking about it.
New homeowners accepted it without question. The controversy faded into something quieter, a cautionary tale. The ranch returned to its rhythm, unchanged by the noise it had endured. The land didn't care about meetings or motions. It responded only to stewardship, compliance, and time. And somewhere in the HOA's archived records, the story remained, documented not as a feud, but as a case study in what happens when imagined power collides with real authority. Because the lesson was never about a gate. It was about understanding where control ends, where accountability begins, and how quickly confidence collapses when it's unsupported by law. The HOA learned that lesson the hard way. The ranch owner never had to teach it.